The IMF forecast for global growth is slow to a point of 2.7% in 2023 from 6% in 2021. Meanwhile, inflation remains a looming concern, with banks across the world hiking rates to tame the inflation beast. Deutsche Bank sees a 100% probability of the US slipping into recession. Meanwhile, the Eurozone entered a recessionary phase in the first quarter of this year. In all of this, India and South Asia remain bright spots. What is affecting the world economies and what does it mean for people living in these countries? We'll be discussing all that and more. Joining me at this point in time is Karan Mehrishi. Also with us is Professor Arun Kumar, who's a former economics professor at JNU. With me at this point in time in the studio are my colleagues Kartik Malhotra and Rakesh Khar. Gentlemen, appreciate you all speaking to us. Professor Kumar, I want to directly go and address you at this point in time. Would you agree that India is a bright, shining spot amid global gloom and doom?
Well, not quite, because if you look at the data, our data for GDP growth reflects largely the organized sector. The unorganized sector, which is declining, is not reflected by our data. So when I correct for that, our growth rate is also close to about 1 or 2% and not 7.2% as is officially suggested. And that could slip very hard because if you look at the latest quarterly data, then at current prices, consumption has declined, both for private sector and for government. Only investment has risen. Exports deficit, is also increasing, and that's compensated for by errors. And errors are basically, showing that the data has problems. So in a sense, while the world economy is not growing very fast at the moment, Indian economy is also not growing fast at all. And in South Asia, we have a crisis in various countries. Nepal has slipped into recession now. Sri Lanka has been showing minus 10% rate of growth as of data yesterday. So all this put together, South Asia is not necessarily doing very well either.
South Asia not doing necessarily too well either, but especially in case of India, and Rakesh, perhaps this is a question to you at this point in time, especially in case of India, inflation is well within the estimates. We are growing and growing to an upward of almost 7%. That's the growth figure for last year, and this year is also steady so far. Would you agree with what Professor Kumar had to say there, that it's not looking as bright as we would want it to be?
On a serious note, happy to be an Indian for a change.
Okay.
Well, Professor Kumar has his perspective, which we deeply respect. It's important to note that the data that emanates from India is being assessed and reviewed at various levels in the global fora. So if there is such error of judgment, it would be pointed out by IMF, World Bank. They're not beholden to India to, really respect their data. Of course, the key parameter that goes out of India becomes the benchmark. But yes, the unorganized sector is a challenge and continues to be a challenge. Professor Arun Kumar is right in pointing that out. But we must take some respite in the fact that when the rest of the world, especially our neighborhood and across the seas, is in deep trouble, we are stable and steady and have a certain trajectory. And that trajectory looks definite. On inflation, what is happy about the entire inflation syndrome is that inflation globally has become the #1 enemy. So in that sense, India is right in having identified it as a key challenge. What is happening now globally, inflation is being targeted as the most potent weapon. And when there is no growth or there is less growth, the policymakers, especially politicians of all hues running various governments, even developed economies or developing economies, Shweta, are conscious and mindful of the fact that we have just recovered from COVID, which has put additional pressure on the citizens, all parts of the world. So in that sense, inflation has to be managed. So I think that's why what one would probably call a hawkish stance by policymakers at the central banks across the world is being reflected in that particular stance. Okay. But a good thing net that inflation is being targeted uniformly by one and every central banker.
Okay, and we discussed that story right in the morning, Kartik, how inflation remains a key concern. However, another beast that is, sort of being dealt with silently, and many countries have openly declared they're also pushed into recession. So it's like a double whammy at this point in time. In order to control inflation, you've got to hike rate. If you hike rate, consumption lowers, you slip into recession. How do you tame with this, double-edged sword?
See, Shweta, I think both Rakesh and Professor Kumar will agree with me that monetary policy is a very immediate step that you can take to control inflation. But monetary policy and fiscal policy both have to work in tandem. That means there has to be enough tax collection to compensate for the expenses that the government makes. There has to be, on the current account trade deficit side, there has to be enough export to offset the import bill. So overall, fiscal and monetary policy have to work in tandem. But coming back to the moot question here, I think, look at the map. India definitely, as opposed to, let's say, Germany, UK, New Zealand and the US, is definitely in a greener situation than the rest of the world. And yes, we've been, I think, fairly forthright in going ahead and making supply side reforms. Now, whether you call them investments or whether you call them PLI schemes to boost manufacturing, we've been able to strengthen our supply side fairly well at a time when the West was actually printing currency.
Okay.
So, so yes, while the RBI is taking a hawkish stance now, I think we had taken a fairly hawkish stand from the central governments and also during the pandemic and beyond. Look at what happened when the Russia-Ukraine war started. We went ahead and we imported cheaper oil, which we process and export back to the same West, which is putting sanctions on Russia, while not very intelligently and smartly not coming into the grip of the sanctions ourselves.
Okay.
Right. Now, now what is happening? Let's look at the top 3 economies in the world, for example. USA, you just said Deutsche Bank has come up with a 100% possibility of US entering recession. It should have entered recession by now had we believed every estimate of every policy thinker or any think tank or the Bretton Woods who have been anticipating recession. It hasn't happened. Why? Because again, the monetary policy tightening in the US has been consistent until just 2 days ago, where there was, if I can quote, a hawkish pause taken. A hawkish pause means it's a pause for now, but it may go back to a hawkish stance later.
Okay.
In the European Commission, the European Central Bank, ECB, we saw they have not taken a pause yet. It's the same inflation they are battling. They have not taken a pause, and there is a good chance of rate hike continuing. Even while we see in China there has been a pause. So we'll come to China subsequently. So second largest economy, China. Let's park that for now.
Okay.
Third
I
largest
suppose
economy.
Professor Kumar also wants to butt
Professor
in.
Kumar, just let me finish. Third largest economy, Japan. Again, the same kind of problems. There is a great chance of Japan also entering recession. While if you go back to that map, we'll see India is a little better placed. Yes, Professor Kumar.
Yeah, you know what I wanted to say is that the data that IMF and World Bank use are basically government data. They're not data collecting agencies. There's nobody else other than the government which can put out official data. So therefore, IMF and World Bank data would roughly correspond to what the Indian government's data is. But if you look around, the evidence is from FMCG sector, from textile sector, from leather goods sector, from pressure cooker industry, and so on and so forth. The demand has been shifting from the unorganized to the organized sector. And that's why the GST collections, the direct tax collections, whether it's corporate tax or income tax, they're all coming from the organized sector. So how come when the economy is not doing that well, these tax collections are rising at 20% or thereabouts? That can only be because demand is shifted from the unorganized to the organized sector. So there is plenty of evidence that the unorganized sector has been declining roughly maybe around 10% per annum in the last 2-3 years. And the organized sector is taking advantage of that. That's why if you look at the RBI data on 2,700 companies, that shows that the sales went up by 40% last year and profits by 24%. So when the economy is stagnant and the sales go up, that can only be at the expense of the unorganized sector. You can also see that in the case of trade, where e-commerce has been growing at 20-30%, that can only be at the expense of the neighborhood retail stores and the wholesale trade. So in other words, all data points toward that. The second point I want to point out is that the challenge of inflation is a result of the supply bottlenecks and of the Ukraine war, which has added to the supply bottlenecks, which were already existing during the pandemic. it's not a demand side problem. It's not as if demand was very high in India because of which the inflation was high. It was because of indirect taxes, like on taxes on petroleum goods, which raised the prices. It was also because of the supply bottlenecks that were there. So central bank has a little role to play when the supply bottlenecks are there. If the demand was a problem, then by increasing interest rates and lowering liquidity, you could cut back inflation. So in other words, inflation requires, as was being said, both a fiscal component and a small monetary component. The monetary component is required because if we don't raise interest rates corresponding to what's happening abroad in the US and Eurozone, then capital flight would take place, rupee would weaken, that would raise inflation, and further it would create balance of payment problems. So in other words, we are forced to raise interest rates along with what's happening abroad. So in other words, the monetary policy only is trying to prevent capital from going abroad.
Okay.
So supply side reforms like PLI have not really delivered. We had in 2020 we started it with 1.9 lakh crores of promised money to be given under PLI, but data day before shows that only 2,900 crores has been given, whereas 3,400 crores has been demanded. So the supply side responses have not been very strong. We had 1.6 lakh crore cut in the corporate taxes in 2019. That did not increase the private sector's investment. The PLI has not brought about much except for the example of Apple. There's not much else to quote there. So the government itself is saying that we'll have to review the PLI scheme. So in other words, we have to be very careful in analyzing the government data.
All right.
To see where we stand.
Let's quickly also get in Karan into the conversation. Karan Mehrishi joining us at this point in time. Karan, I want to understand from you, would you agree with Professor Kumar, important, interesting data that he's quoting with respect to PLI? Do you think the PLI offtake has not been as it was anticipated?
Yes, of course. I mean, that is now being witnessed. And I think it has to do with the rising interest rates across the world, which is sort of impeding global interest in creating capacities in emerging markets. But then this is a hiatus, I think, and a new investment should be coming in, especially given the fact that the US is now following the China +1 strategy. And because of that, I think global supply chains will have to reshuffle. So the PLI scheme, I believe, will get some kind of a fillip in the coming quarters. So even though they are reviewing the scheme, but I don't really see the scheme sort of falling down at this point in time. So I'm quite positive about the scheme going forward.
And we tracked that story as well with respect to government trying to review PLI scheme. Rakesh, let me quickly bring you in. Government, they're admitting that there are certain sectors that have been laggard, mainly due to the gestation period of those sectors. And Professor Kumar pointing at how there are problems with the supply side. There have not been many takers for PLI except for Apple that we keep quoting. Would you agree with that broadly?
Well, there are a couple of fundamental points. First of all, what Professor Kumar is pointing about PLI, there's always a review possible, which should happen at every quarter, I guess. Like a financial company does quarterly review. Any big scheme at that scale where government is spending money should be reviewed. So I'm very happy with the review. I don't have a challenge with the review. There is a gestation period. It's a new intent, it's a new idea, it's a new strategy. In that sense, it takes time. And today we have seen Foxconn is getting into setting up another independent plant. We don't have official confirmation, but it is just
for EVs.
For EVs, I say it's an unrelated line in that sense. And there is a flood of interest. I think the minister has gone on record, Piyush Goyal, that we have huge interest coming in. These things take time, and we are just recovering from a very bad virus which had a known and unknown trajectory. So review is welcome. But let's not be pessimistic about the PLI output in that sense. And it's being expanded to a few other sectors. There would be greater interest there. On the larger point, of Professor Arun Kumar about formalizing an informalized economy, we have a challenge there. Let's face it. But anecdotal evidence, there is no independent evidence, because putting data into science when it comes to informal economy in India calls for a huge effort and huge task. I don't think anyone has that capability right now, but we must build that capacity to monitor and map the entire informal economy. But on the ground, I mean, I can give my example. I live in a suburban society in East Delhi. After the e-commerce thing kicked off, we still are about 3 to 5% of e-commerce overall all India penetration. The growth may have witnessed some 20, 30, 100% year on year or quarter on quarter, but I've only seen, about 50% growth in the number of retail stores, mom and pop stores outside my residence, and some of them coming inside the society.
Okay.
So on ground, because all these are being, there is a cross linkage that's happening. That's the beauty of the e-commerce setup. It is not operating in thin air, it's operating in the ecosystem. The ecosystem is happy to host the mom and pop stores. I don't think there is any deliberate design or some God-ordained design to kill the mom and pop stores. That is not the intent of either the FDI direct indirect policy or a big corporate. They can't exist if they don't put them or co-opt them. When you co-opt, it's a business transaction. If you have the might in it, you will make merit of it. If you don't have the might in it, you will perish. Because I don't think any economy, any policy mandates that nobody will perish. I think we moved that era.
Right. And essentially, the conversation around, I think what Professor Kumar alluded to, in fact, previously also, and he's with us, but perhaps he can expand on that, is that we're not being able to track the growth in informal sector. And what we essentially always keep talking about is the formal sector, which essentially may not be a substantial part of a good tracker of growth development in the country. So informal sector, what's happening there is a concern, apart from agriculture, where we know where the growth is, and which is, by the way, come in surprisingly well at about 5% in the last quarter. Other sectors remain relatively untapped, and he talked about FMCG products to other indicators, and those indicators perhaps pointing at a fact that it's the consumption and demand has shifted from informal to formal economy.
Right. So, like Rakesh pointed out, collection of data for the informal economy is obviously a Herculean task, right? And hence very, very difficult to do that and achieve something out of it. But I think there is, if you were to compare formal economy versus formal economy, and if there is growth there, it is growth. If you were to look at informal economy also migrating to formal economy, that's growth as well. That is good for the country. That is good for the taxpayer. That is good for the citizens.
We shouldn't see the shift from informal to formal economy as a vice.
Okay.
Isn't it? That's what you're trying to
say. Exactly.
Okay. Professor Kumar, let me quickly bring you in before we shift focus to what's happening worldwide, move away a little bit from India.
Yeah, so when the demand shifts away from informal or unorganized sector to the organized sector, that means the unorganized sector declines and the organized sector grows, and that's what data seems to suggest. Your GST collections are, as Arun Jaitley used to say, 5% units pay 95% of the tax. So if the GST collection is going at 20%, and that reflects the growth in the organized sector, that can only be at the expense of the unorganized sector. And you have the chairman, Mr. Jagannathan of the pressure cooker industry saying we have 5 units in the organized sector, 25 in the unorganized, and we are growing at 24% because the unorganized sector is declining. You have the leather goods sector, similar statement from Mr. Podar of the luggage industry, etc. So here the organized sector itself, FMCG, Hindustan Unilever, last year report says that our market share is doing well because the small scale sector is unable to grow, is declining. So you have all these evidences from various sectors, which are the mass sectors, that the unorganized sector is declining. Unemployment is very high because the organized sector doesn't offer much employment. It's only 6% of the employment. Unorganized sector is 94% of the employment. So if the unorganized sector declines, then it hits your unemployment very hard. And that means demand in the economy goes down. So while the organized sector does well, unorganized sector declines, and that's what people call the K-shaped recovery. So when you include the decline in the unorganized sector, then the rate of growth no more remains 7.2%, as the government says. And what I wrote in my recent article, it comes down to more like 1 or 2% rate of growth in the economy. So that's why I've been arguing that there's enough evidence, and we can ignore that. While we can give our own private experiences of how retail stores are growing, I can tell you my experience. Before the pandemic, 100% we went to the neighborhood store. Now 90% we are ordering from the e-commerce, as opposed to, so that's the case of a lot of middle class and upper middle class families are ordering, whether it be your food order, your groceries order, etc., coming from Blinkit, etc. So in a sense, even we are experiencing a decline in our visit to the shops. But I'm not going by this. I'm going by the rates of growth. The rates of growth seem to suggest that the unorganized sector is declining rather rapidly. And my own visits to the slum areas around Delhi, Bhalaswa, etc., where people are complaining of massive unemployment. Women, the labor force participation rate of women is more like 26%. They're not able to get work. Youth, especially 15 to 29 age group, the more educated you are, the more unemployment there is. And that's why recently for 50,000 jobs in UP, 54 lakh applied, including BTech, MTech, etc. And these were grade C, grade D jobs. Similarly for railway, grade C, grade D jobs, 35,000 in 2019, 1.3 crore people applied, and only 7 lakh were called for interviews. So there is a massive problem of unemployment and underemployment, which results in shortage of demand. So our industry faces the problem of shortage of demand, and that's why capacity utilization has been more like 75%, at which the investment by the private sector doesn't quite get buoyed. You need to go to 80-85% for investment rate to rise sharply, and that's when the growth rate will also rise.
Professor Kumar, if I may just ask you this very fundamental question. Now, even if I were to agree with you that that the data that you are alluding to is absolutely correct, and there is a slowdown in demand in the informal economy, but eventually with the supply side reforms, with boosted infrastructure, with schemes like PLI, which will help set up or exacerbate the setup of factories, isn't employment also then going to move from the unorganized sector to the organized sector, and eventually the tax net widens? There are more number of people in the formal sector paying taxes, and at the same time there is better GST collection as well, which in any case was the mandate of the PLI scheme, that by way of incentivizing the supply side, the tax collection that would happen through GST is going to more than offset the 1.97 lakh crores earmarked for the PLI scheme. So overall, in the long run, I'm not talking about present day today, I'm not talking about 16 June 2023, but let's say 3 years, 5 years hence, isn't all this going to accentuate the whole mobilization of the informal economy into the formal economy, which will overall be good for the country?
So, what we should look at is the net employment. 6% working in the organized sector produce 55% of the output, and 46% working in agriculture produce 14% of the output, and the balance, roughly about 48% produce the 31% of output in the unorganized sector. So when you displace the unorganized sector by the organized sector, then where 15 people are working in the unorganized sector, only 1 is required in the organized sector. So if demand is shifting from the unorganized to the organized sector, then for every 1 additional employment in the organized sector, you're going to displace roughly 13 people in the unorganized sector. So that's why the unemployment situation has been
But so should we look at demand specifically, internal demand, and wouldn't this also help fulfill external demand by way of exports?
No, so, in the net, we are actually deficit. So the demand is generated by imports, export minus import.
Yeah.
And we are deficit, and therefore, we are not generating demand there as a result of additional export.
Not yet, sir, not today. But I'm saying, not today, sir, I agree with you. But in time, wouldn't the supply side reforms and the mobilization of the informal sector to the formal sector help create enough manufacturing capacity to be able to export outside?
The more you manufacture in the organized sector at the expense of the unorganized sector, the more unemployment you'll have. And that's why even before the pandemic, we had reached a record high of unemployment of 45%.
So could you clarify by what you mean at the expense of the unorganized sector?
Demand shifting from the unorganized to the organized sector. That means what was being produced by the unorganized sector now being produced in the organized sector. So the unorganized sector units, which consist of small units and the micro units, and we must recognize that there are 6,000 large units, 6 lakh small and medium units, and 6 crore micro units. It's the micro units and the small units that are closing down, and the large scale sector doesn't generate much employment given the automation, etc. So that's why when you have 1 unit of output, which was earlier produced in the unorganized sector being produced in the organized sector, then where in the unorganized sector 15 people are working, now only 1 will be working in the organized sector, and that's why the unemployment situation is acute in India. Our labor force participation rate is roughly around 46%, whereas in similar countries like Brazil, China, USA, it is 65%. That means in the labor force, which is 15 to 64 years of age, we have 20% less people working. That's a
Right.
huge amount of unemployment. That's about 19 crore
Absolutely,
people.
no. Unemployment is a problem, and we will talk about unemployment. Let me also quickly get in Karan Mehrishi to join in on the conversation. Karan, you've been listening so far. I understand you have some inputs to give. Also, while you talk about it, would you largely agree with what Mr. Kumar has to say?
Yeah, I agree with the professor, but just to add to what he was saying, we also have to understand here, Shweta, that unorganized economy has also given India a high purchasing power net per household. So if you compare that, so if you compare the purchasing power parity, the purchasing power of a household as compared to the nominal purchasing power of a household, then the per capita income of Indian household almost becomes fourfold when you talk about from the perspective of purchasing power. Now, this is happening because India is a highly unorganized economy. So we have to understand that if the economy evolves too fast into an organized economy, then the cost of living also goes up substantially. So the reason why Indian households enjoy low inflation comparatively, and
Okay, I think. All right, I'm told he's gone on mute at this point in time. Let me, before Karan unmutes himself, I think interesting conversation there. And I wanted to quickly shed some light on what's happening on global economies, but we are too caught up discussing the formal versus informal sector. Essentially, I think a couple of points that we agree and a couple of points that we disagree. What we essentially agree on, unemployment is a problem. Unemployment is a problem that the government needs to cater to. But also, with respect to what Kartik was saying, more supply side reforms would also mean more people getting into the tax net, which gives them a job, essentially makes them a part of the formal structure, and then they can be taxed eventually. Yes,
There's
yes,
a global
Rakesh.
template. It's
Yes.
not either or today, as Kartik rightly mentioned. We need to, so to say, bring about that electric growth in both the segments of the economy. So we don't have an option, either politically or economically, to say that we don't want the unorganized sector to fire and we want only the organized sector to fire. I don't think any government, any policy maker, be it the central ruled states or the states where the center is not ruling, there is a consensus on that particular perspective. COVID led a massive blow to the informal sector. So obviously it's taking time to recover. But globally, there is a basic fundamental economic principle which I'm happy to be corrected on. If you need large scale employment, it will happen with big ticket capital investment. That is not going to happen in the small scale sector.
True.
Largest employment will happen when the big capital comes in. There are large capexes, there are big factories of the world. Factories of the world will lead to large employment. And there is a merit in a certain employment. I mean, I don't think any economy can afford to give employment to someone not on merit.
Yeah.
So this ability to drags we have the challenge of having the youngest economy, youngest population pool, educated but not having.
Right.
So let's get certain things absolutely right. There is no quarrel between not kicking up the the informal sector, but it has its severe limitations. As an economic model globally, which is one country where small scale sector is actually driving the larger part of the economy. I want to be educated on that. 75% of capital, or the GDP is driven by private sector, and private sector, it is big companies who generate big jobs, big projects.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Kumar.
No, private large-scale sector doesn't generate much jobs, and that's why in 1990, if you look at the data, our workforce was 250 million, and we had only about 27 million jobs in the organized sector at that time. Now our workforce is about 600 million, and we still have only 36 million jobs. So the expansion of the large scale doesn't generate jobs because it's highly automated, and this is not just India's problem; it is a problem globally. And that's why Mr. Trump was saying we'll bring jobs back to America from China, India, etc. Because the USA has been losing.
But pardon my saying, sir, only through Harley Davidson. It's not a small scale sector company. For instance.
And by bringing business back into America, I suppose that is what he meant, by bringing factories back into America.
Factories back, But
Harley
the
Davidson
point
is an example. He
point
fought
is
individually as the president of the US for one particular company. Because that's the sentiment I'm talking about.
Right.
We're not either or. We do want small scale to really grow and become medium and then become a large scale. That's what's happening on the stock markets.
No, but that doesn't happen, automatically. China has done that, If you look at the 1980s, their village industries dramatically increased at about 30% per annum. And that's how they industrialized. In India, unfortunately, what's happening is the small scale in the cottage sector, the micro sector, that has been stagnating or declining. The reason is that in China, they provided, through government support, technology, marketing, and finance to the village and the micro units. In India, that's not the case. So the problem is that our, supply side responses are not leading to R&D. They're not leading to technology. The chaebols in South Korea, which grew very big, they developed technology. Whether you look at Samsung, LG, etc. But in India, our conglomerates like Reliance and Adani and the Tatas, they're hardly doing any research. Even the TCS and the Infosys, etc., which are cash rich, do not really do much research. That's why our R&D expenditure nationally is 0.75% of GDP, whereas China is spending 3.5%, and their economy is 5 times larger than us. So they spend 25 times more R&D than we in India do, and that's why they've developed 5G. We did not develop 2G, 3G, 4G at all. You look at the LCA, light combat aircraft, our engine has not worked. We are now bargaining with the US to give us the G414. We've been using the G404 from 1993 onward. So in R&D, we are lagging behind. Supply side responses work only if technology is developed. And that technology development is not being taken up in the private sector. Technology development is slowed down in the public sector because you're forcing public sector to generate higher profits, and the easiest way to generate profit is to cut on R&D. So the whole environment is not there to generate R&D, which is the only way we can become self-sufficient, and where we can boost the micro sector as well as the small sector and the large sector. So our supply side policies are not quite designed for the long-term growth.
Sir, I agree with you on the R&D bit, but you mentioned that the private sector is not, with capital investment, the private sector will be automated and is not going to generate enough employment. I have a bit of a disconnect there. And if you were to look at, let's say, the number of people employed after the armed forces and the Indian railways and paramilitary forces, you've got Tata Group that employs about 1 million people in India, 9,35,000 people as of last year, 2022. You've got Infosys at 3,14,000 people. You've got Accenture at 300,000 people. An international company, its offices in India, has got 3,300,000 people.
Please add it all up. Please
Move
add
to
it all
Reliance
up.
Industries, 2,36,000. These are big numbers, sir.
No, but in the organized sector, the total you have only 35 million in the organized sector out of a workforce of 600 million. That's why the organized sector only employs 6% of the workforce.
So hence, isn't it better that the organized sector gets further cemented to set up more shops, to set up more offices, more factories, and give more employment?
Not at the expense of the unorganized sector. When the demand is stagnant and the organized sector expands, then it can only be at the expense of the unorganized sector. And as I said,
but demand will also increase, right? If there is more employment in the informal sector, demand will also go up.
No. If the unorganized sector decreases, the demand goes down, because that's when 94% are employed. And the e-Shram portal data tells you that there are 28 crore people who registered by November, and of the 28 crore, 94% said they earn less than 10,000 rupees per month. So it's a very small income. It's close to the poverty line income for 94% in the unorganized sector. The demand cannot be very large. And the Delhi Socioeconomic Survey of 2018 suggested that in Delhi, which has a per capita income 3 times the all India per capita income, there what you find is that 98% spend less than 50,000 rupees per month, and 90% spend less than 25,000 rupees per month. Divide that by 2.5 and you find that all India, what it translates to is that 98% spend less than 20,000 rupees per month, and 90% spend less than 10,000 rupees per month. There cannot be much demand coming out. So unless the unorganized incomes go up, unless farm incomes go up, demand will not go up. Demand will not go up.
So, in one line, I think Shweta will tell us that we are running out of time, but I'll just take this moment before that. In one line, what would be your recipe then? Do not incentivize the large companies, do not incentivize big scale factory setups, rather divert funds into the farm sector, divert funds into the MSME sector. Is that your recipe for India's economic growth?
Yes. So that's where 94% of the employment is, and unless you boost agriculture income, unless you boost micro sector sector and the small sector, your demand is not going to go up. 6% of the workforce cannot provide the large demand that is required. Once you boost the demand for the micro sector and the agriculture sector, demand for organized sector will also go up.
I agree, sir. So just on pure economics, again, in the interest of time, I'll be as quick as possible. Now, if there is this demand that gets generated through the unorganized sector, farm sector, MSMEs, clusters of businesses where medium-sized and small-sized companies operate, and if there isn't enough supply available, are we not looking at inflation again? The equilibrium is going to be met at a much higher point.
No, the supply will also grow. Because when your agriculture is boosted...
So that's what the supply side reforms are already underway, sir. Doesn't it bring us back to the question?
I think it's a common at one level. If we,
supply side, what it does is it gives concessions to large businesses, as like the PLI scheme. PLI scheme is not targeted to small and the micro sector, it's only targeted to the large and the medium sector. And that's where the employment generation is very low. So if you give, for instance, MSP in the rural areas, in the agriculture sector, farm incomes go up. From farming, the last data survey that was done, average farmer earns 27 rupees per person per day, which is abysmally low, which is close to the poverty line. So if your agriculture incomes go up, demand for everything will go up. If your micro sector incomes go up, demand for everything will go up. And therefore, what you'll find is that, your large scale sector will grow and your supplies from these sectors will grow also. They are 31% of the output from the non-agriculture unorganized sector and 15% from the agriculture unorganized sector. So that's 45%. If that 45% increases demand, you can see how organized and unorganized both will start growing.
So, sir, you are saying consumption in the economy will go up, but then at the cost of investments.
And supply.
Sure, but at the cost of investment. So overall to the GDP, I'm just going back to very basics, macroeconomic theory, y is equal to c plus g plus I plus x minus m. You're saying we look at boosting the c and the consumption in the economy, but not as much the I. So net result is going to be much different.
No. So if you look at it, our investment peaked in 2012-13 at 36%.
Yeah.
After that, the fall of demand, investment rate went down to 30%, and investment rate has not recovered. And that's because demand was short. When demand picks up, your investment rate will also go up in the economy. So the balance between consumption and investment will also change, and the investment rate will not fall. And investment rate will rise, then capacity utilization rises to 80-85%. We've been running at between 72 and 75% capacity utilization, which is not good enough. If I can produce 100 cars, but I'm only selling 72 to 75 cars, why would I invest to produce 110 cars? But if the demand goes up and my sales go up to 85 cars out of 100, then I'll set up capacity for another 10. So capacity utilization has to rise, consumer confidence has to rise, and you know that consumer confidence in the economy as per the RBI data was 104 in January 2020, just before the pandemic, and that has not recovered. It's recovered only to 82 now.
Okay.
So the consumer confidence is down, the capacity utilization is down, and both of them have to be raised. And that will come only when the unorganized sector is boosted. Okay, let me give a final word to Karan Mehrishi, who's been waiting patiently all this while. Karan, we will wind up with you.
Yeah, so Shweta, just to, I have a contradictory statement to make here. Now, the thing is that if you remember what Henry Ford said regarding his cars when he was making Ford Model T back in the early 1900s, and he said, and somebody asked him that who would buy your cars, and he said the people who are making them. So basically, what we have to understand here is that the economy is not horizontally integrated; it is vertically integrated. So if you do not have an organized sector to drive demand, then the output does not expand. So while the unorganized or the informal economy is important for consumption, but the overall output rises because of the formal economy, which creates capacities and invests in the economy. So I don't fully agree with the assumption that unorganized sector is the penultimate component in economic expansion.
Okay.
No,
okay.
Can I quickly correct what Henry Ford said was that unless my workers have higher income, they won't buy the cars, and then there's no point in mass producing the cars. So Henry Ford said that we have to, and recently, if you notice, George Buffett has also said that my secretary receives a very low income, and capitalism cannot survive unless that's done. So he said that, there should be greater taxation of the rich people, and he was supported by the American rich, the German rich, the French rich, and the Italian rich, because they said that capitalism cannot survive. And that's why now the World Bank talks about the universal basic income, saying that we have to give income in the hands of people who don't have employment. And now
this is going to be an endless debate around capitalism versus socialism. We will come back to it, Professor Arun Kumar. It's a pleasure listening to you, sir. It's a pleasure listening to you. Unfortunately, we are way out of time at this point in time. We'll bring you back. We'll have a larger debate around this, but we're going to shift focus for now. If you're planning to buy a consumer electronic product like a TV, fridge or smartphone this festive season, there could be a lot more choices to opt from. Top brands are expected to be lining up their highest spending on consumer offers, discounts and promotions to revive demand and clear inventory. Companies are also expected to pass on the declining rate in input costs to consumers to bolster demand that has been tepid for the past 12 months. This could in fact lift pressure off the operating margins, giving some leeway to companies to pass on benefits to people who would be buying these end products. Joining us at this point in time is Rajesh Tamble, who is an analyst and covers FMCG sector. Rajesh, appreciate you taking time out. I want to understand what exactly is going to drive the demand this festive season. Why exactly are electronic goods going to get cheaper, if at all?
See, one is that, in fact, the aspiration levels of the people in India are really high. Secondly, in fact, I'm looking at, the per capita income, of course, is going up. We have the largest middle class in India, which is more than the population of the US. The quantum of the people, in fact, who are shifting from villages to the cities, of course, is at the rate of 45%. So that's a too high rate. And India is, of course, the fastest growing economy. In fact, I was listening to all this debate of the informal and the formal sector. But I suppose, one thing, in fact, which I'm very practical at is that, in fact, we are the fastest growing economy. And these are the demographic dividend, which is the highest in India. So if I'm very positive about it. So I think, the consumer good industry is going to do very well because you have a huge population. And secondly, because of, these financial companies which are giving you loans. So, the purchases which you are supposed to do it, the forward purchases, the future purchases, you're bringing it to the present purchases because of these easy loans. So I suppose, that is driving what is the demand is. Suppose if I have to buy a washing machine 2 years down the line, I'm buying it today. It's only because of these easy loan facilities.
Okay, but essentially, from the news items that we read, prices of electronic components is also down due to a global fall in demand, and all of that could mean that your TV, your fridge, your electronic goods, the white goods could get cheaper.
Exactly, because one of the sophisticated refrigerators, in fact, which we're talking about today, which are manufactured by Samsung, which are manufactured by all these global brands. Come to think of it, today in India, you're getting a refrigerator for a price of 40,000 to 60,000 and one of the best refrigerators with all the best features. So, definitely, it's a question of demand and supply, and prices have to be cheaper. And don't forget, these companies are making good amount of profits. No company, of course, is going to sell it at a cheaper price at a loss. Every company is going to make profits. And if you're looking at the results of the Indian corporates, you're looking at the results of the public sectors for this particular fiscal, they've done fantastic for themselves. All the public sectors have made amazing profits. All the private sectors have made amazing profits.
I don't necessarily agree with all. I don't agree with that, sir. I don't agree necessarily all companies have made great profits. In fact, we are given to understand Samsung has posted a operation profit fall of almost 95%. So, and this is a global chip maker. The fact that there is going to be lesser demand is one of the reasons why you have electronic makers, the component makers and makers of white goods lowering the price point because there has been a fall in demand. So essentially not all of them are making profit. The idea is that they're ready to take losses in their books to make up for fall in demand.
Yeah, but that particularly, I'm not talking about the American markets or the European markets. I'm particularly talking about India.
I'm talking about Indian markets, sir. The demand in Indian market has also been very low.
Yes, but in India, majority of the companies, if you're looking at, I'm talking about an average.
Give me names.
If you look at the
please do give me names.
Majority of the companies.
Yes.
Sorry.
Sir, if you could give me names, please. Which are these companies?
Well, if you're talking about public sector, Hindustan Aeronautics has posted very good profits. DHL has got very good profits today. They've got very good order books. In fact, now they're shifting to super critical boilers. and turbines, in fact, where these guys never had the coal orders because everybody was talking about green energy. Now, because of the gas prices going up, good amount of order books have got into the books of BHEL. Now they have very good order books. So, your thermal projects are back into action. BHEL is going to perform very well. Hindustan Aeronautics is doing well. And a few of these the private sectors are also doing well. In totality, I'm talking about the results have been fantastic.
Okay. All right, so the results have been fantastic and that is likely to reflect in consumer demand going forward. Appreciate you, sir, taking time out and joining us on this bulletin. But essentially, the story that is coming out right now and is being reported in various newspapers and in media is that electronic items, electronic goods, components and your white goods, essentially from TV to a fridge to an AC, could get a lot more cheaper, largely on the back of the fact that makers are hoping that they will be able to push out their existing inventory into the market and hence are going to make it lucrative for people to buy these items. We will of course keep tracking all those stories, but that's all we have in this bulletin. Thanks very much for watching.
3, 2, 1, now.
It's stealthy, lethal and precise. The BrahMos kills warships. It flies 3 times the speed of sound. Once it acquires a target, it can cut through a warship like a hot knife through butter. China has assembled the world's largest navy. Its neighbors are feeling threatened by the dragon's military might. Many of them are turning to BrahMos to enhance their firepower.
The BrahMos supersonic missile can be launched from land, air, sea and underwater.